All right, so my name is Mary Phillips. I am an assistant professor in the Department of Africana Studies at Lehman College, and I will serve as your moderator this evening. This is the third program in the Lehman Art Gallery Black History Month lecture series, so we're really excited about that. We will have about a 40-minute conversation followed by a Q&A. And I want to begin by introducing our lovely speakers. And I'm going to start with Eure. Eure received her PhD in English from the University of Pennsylvania and a BA in Portuguese and Brazilian Studies from Smith College. She specializes in 19th century African American literature with a focus on the intermeshed histories of Black and Indigenous people and the visual culture of race and kinship. Her current research project, The Grammar of Kinship, Black and Native Intimacies in the 19th Century, explores the literary and legal effacement of Black and Native bonds and the new forms of kin-making and literary production that accompany that effacement. She has presented work from the project at the Native American and Indigenous Studies Association, the American Studies Association, and the Critical and Ethnic Studies Association. Augustus Durham, is an assistant professor of English at Lehman College. His research focuses on Black study from the 19th century to the 21st centuries. His current book project examines how melancholy catalyzes performances of genius. Prior to Lehman, Durham was the president postdoctoral fellow in English at the University of Maryland, College Park. I am excited to begin our conversation, and I want to start with a question that is geared towards both of you, and that is, can you both discuss how your work on Frederick Douglass and Harriet Jacobs speaks to the themes of kinship and radical love?
Eva, do you want to go? All right, I can go.
No, you can go. Yeah, that's great.
Well, again, thank you for inviting me to this event, and certainly thank you to Dr. Phillips for moderating the event with us tonight. The Frederick Douglass kinship and radical love. I mean, I think that in a lot of ways, as per my presentation last week, that for Douglass, the radical love really begins at his nuclear family, which of course is also like the site of his kinship. And in particular, the fact that for Douglass, when he says, my brothers and sisters were strangers to me, my mother was made a myth to me, my father was unknown to me, and I have no intelligible beginning in the world. He already kind of stakes a claim for himself as almost kind of like a wayward figure who's just born, who kind of emerges. And then is kind of really navigating the world in a way to try to find his full self. And so I think that, in terms of the kinship and the radical love, that it really does start, kind of proverbially at home, where for Douglass, so much of the investment is really reclaiming the mother who's the myth, and also recognizing that in many ways, his mother is part of a genealogy of women, including his grandmother, who really actually kind of usher in his possibility through matrilineage. So I would say that, I think that that's where the love and kinship emerges. And then I think furthermore, when you think about how he stakes a claim to even his intellect, which I think is also a way that he wants to channel a kind of kinship and love. When he channels it through his mother, who he refers to as a genius, for being the only person in that part of Maryland who knew how to read because there were no faculties that would allow such things to happen. I think that in and of itself too is a kind of way that he can try to kind of kinship and radical love, even though there's all this rumor around his what he calls his intelligible beginning.
I think for me, I was trying to think about in the chapter that I presented, but the larger kind of project that I'm looking at in terms of like playing around with this idea that Horton Spiller introduces us to, this sort of the idea of the grammar of kinship. And so I was thinking about kinship, um, like what does kinship and what does intimacy and what does love look like in a space of enclosure? And so for me, when I think about, and what I was trying to do with Harriet Jacobs's work, and the way that she kind of narrates kinship, um, is to kind of think about one, like what are the possibilities of those forms and those relationships in enclosure? And so, you know, when I encountered this text for the first time, I thought there was so much love and family in the text. And so, but I think I had a professor who was like, no, it's impossible within like spaces of enclosure. This is kind of foreclosed by the legal structures, by her master. And so I just refuse that reading of it. And so partly how I'm thinking about kinship in this text is um, I wanted to think about it as like intergenerational. And it became important for me to see how that unfolds in the text. And so kinship for me is both something that's collective. Um, and I explore, I have other chapters that kind of think about it outside of the biological. But for me, it was important to think about kinship as something that is a, I call it a collective utterance, drawing on Saidiya Hartman's work, but like thinking about the way that it's also being narrated by Black women. And so like kinship is something that's collective. It's something that's also in that like collective utterance. And I think like, you know, partly what we see Harriet Jacobs doing in the text is like biological kinship is also kind of fictive kinship. So like she's kind of narrating the stories of other enslaved people, and this becomes something that unsettles, disrupts a sense of like biological kinship. And so for me, like kinship, it's like it's and sort of centering like that as like a Black female radical practice of refusal becomes important to trace as like as like generational, as something that's like occurring, and it begins with her grandmother and it's like oral and it's a testimony. And so for me, kinship is like all those things, and it's occurring even in places that it shouldn't. And so the struggle is like, how do you read it in so like how do you read kinship in play, and how do you read love in these places, even when it's like, you know, that there's a chapter called The Lovers. And so for me, that chapter is not about like couplehood or the potential of couplehood or the refusal, the denial of it because of legal structures. For me, that's about family. The end of that chapter, there's a, you know, the word that's used over and over again, it's like still. So there's like, even at the level of language, like the kind of repetition of like still, meaning, and then she was still, I have love. And what she points to is like her grandmother and her brother, not the lover. And so there's a way that she's even disrupting notions of like what is conjugal love. And the love that she has is like familial love. And then it's just important for me to think about that in terms of that text because of longer histories in social science around like the disruption of the Black family. And so and that's a text like a slave narrative, it's not supposed to be there, but it's there. And so for me, it's also like what kinship is doing there is like she's offering us a like a practice of method for reading. And so it's like it's embedded in the text, and so it's like so yeah, so that's how I sort of think about kinship and radical love.
All right. So Augustus, in your presentation, you shared a commercial featuring Frederick Douglass, all about hair love. Can you discuss the life of Frederick Douglass as a Pan-African, particularly in the context of the Hair Love commercial?
So the commercial is kind of an interesting object in part because, and here I'm thinking a lot about a recent paper that I heard given by um, Jasmine Nicole Cobb in her burgeoning project on hair. Um, to me, what's really interesting about the commercial is, so it's linked to Afro Sheen. And the interesting thing about Afro Sheen at that moment is, you know, there's this way in which they recuperate Douglass as this kind of interesting figure who emerges, you know, at this kid's bedroom door and talks to them about the progress of the people. There are all these other Afro Sheen commercials that are also trafficking in an interesting form of kind of Black historicity. So for instance, there's one where the Queen of Sheba is kind of like the muse, and she's sitting on a throne and she has an afro. I think it's the Queen of Sheba, and I want to say Cleopatra, if I recall. So, you know, like in those ways, it's kind of interesting to think that even though Afro Sheen is being deployed in the United States during Soul Train, you know, again, the hippest trip in America, that like there's this kind of counter history, or not even counter history, or parallel history that Afro Sheen really wants to take up around like Africanity in a particular way. And so in the commercial, you see, for me, at least the things that are interesting to me are precisely the poster of Jesse Jackson, who appears to be in something like a dashiki, this African mask, and then these university decals on the wall. And so some of what makes me interested in those kinds of objects within that object is in the second autobiography, when Douglass narrates this idea of his mother being a having a head that resembles Ramses II, this pharaoh in this anthropological text. There's this interesting kind of rundown that happens in the paragraph around it that always is intriguing to me. So he basically makes James McCune Smith is writing it and basically makes the case that, like, you know, if we're to read Douglass's intellect in light of this kind of referential move toward his mother looking like this pharaoh, you know, if we're to read his intellect, it comes from his mother. But then he kind of flips it. So what he does is he puts Douglass in a kind of interesting genealogy of these Black performers. So Ira, I'm gonna forget his name. Mrs. Greenfield, Ira, I'm gonna forget his last name. It'll come to me. But puts him in this kind of genealogy, and then makes an interesting move where he talks about Caucasians emerging from horses, and then that Egyptians are mixed race, and that blood runs from the throne in the mud hovels. So that already we're seeing that, like, even though, again, Douglass is deployed in this Afro Sheen commercial as a kind of, you know, American hair product that, you know, keeps your fro, you know, nice and even, and, you know, makes it look and have this kind of interesting sheen, that even the kind of deployment of the African mask is like totally referential of this moment in the second autobiography where he's saying, you know, like the intellect comes from the mother, and, you know, like, and Douglass is a part of this long genealogy that we can track all the way back to Egypt, whereby, you know, we recognize that these mixed race people are, you know, are mixing around the throne and the mud hovels. The other thing that I'll say too, that I think maybe also kind of plays into the notion of like kind of a Pan-African affect, is that, of course, on the other hand, Douglass also travels to Egypt, right? So that in some ways, Douglass is already making a case in 1855 of what we will, you know, and even though there was already kind of this rhetoric in the 19th century, you know, that Douglass is actually making a case for like being an African American in a really kind of interesting way, you know, like that I can trace this thing to Egypt. But the other thing too is that even at the level of the rhetoric in the paragraph around him becoming, him gaining this intellect from his mother, that there's a way that even it foreshadows some of what like the Nation of Islam will say about kind of like, the making of, the white man, and, that the white man is, Ariba, I think it's called Arita Nutrix is what it's called in the paragraph. So even at the level of just talking about Africa and talking about the kind of Pan-Africanism that Douglas is a part of, he's also, or James Buchanan Smith at the very least, is kind of spinning these really interesting tropes that we actually see trafficking all the way into the 20th century that I think in some ways makes all the things that happen at that one time in the commercial, the poster of Jesse Jackson, the African mask, and the decals of the universities, they all conglomerated at this one moment. And so then at the end, when the teenager says, ain't nobody gonna believe this, it kind of really sets up this interesting way in which, like, oh my gosh, all these things are happening at once around Frederick Douglass. Like, how unbelievable is that kind of conglomeration all at once?
All right. Eve, what does Harriet Jacobs offer us about intimacy, literal or affective, during slavery that is perhaps antithetical to certain perspectives around agency or sexuality under the visible institution?
I know I should, like, you gave me this question, and why do I feel like, I think I was confused by the question when I got it. And so you're asking me about intimacy, like how does she represent intimacy, or how is intimacy functioning in the text?
Literal or affective, yeah.
Especially considering that, so I mean, in some ways you actually kind of hit on it in your first response, like how does she deal with intimacy in the text, considering that oftentimes we understand the slave to not have access to intimacy or not.
And I think, and it's interesting because the book project uses intimacy in the title, and then I have like this like stream, like kind of, I don't want to define it quite yet, and I keep deferring to kinship. And so for me, I think the intimacy that I'm thinking about in relationship to like what surfaces in Jacobs and what I spoke about is familial, is like stemming from the place of like kin making and family. And so, it's a kind of intimacy that has to be fugitive. It's the kind of intimacy that that presents itself as something otherwise. And I think like the question of intimacy becomes, like right now I'm wrestling with the question of intimacy in terms of its private and public, like manifestations. And so there's a way that also intimacy functions. Like there is no, like, intimacy is also at different moments, something that doesn't have a public and private component. Like, and so I'm thinking about intimacy in terms of like the way that it can be just like altered by like this, by the slave master. So like the grandmother's house becomes a space, like it's a space that's like that can just be like haptically altered. Like, so military troops come in, the slave master comes in, and so there isn't a, so intimacy is both like something that could be like, that is precarious, but something that at different moments can be reconstituted or remade. And so I think like in my thinking about like intimacy as like a term to use, I'm becoming less certain that I want to use it as a way. I actually want to think more along kinship and think about like how kinship produces a certain kind of intimacy that that does different work in terms of in this 19th century moment where, and also later, like I think I'm just struggling with like the private and public, because there's a way that like intimacy for, in terms of like Black enslaved people and Black social life is something that is not, that has to be has to be it's so precarious that it can be invaded, almost like, I want to use Horton's, it can be invaded at any moment. And so like, the house is not really a site of intimacy. The loophole of retreat, in some ways, it at different moments we can glimpse like an intimacy, but like intimacy is something that's so it's momentary. It's fleeting. It's not something that's lasting. And so for me, it's the like intellectual like struggle in the writing of this is like, but then it is something that's like concrete and enduring, and it survives. And so for me, I'm like, is kinship the term that is like more elastic than intimacy, or is it like kinship and intimacy working together to create like modes of like survival, Black survival across generations, that might be defined as intimacy. So I'm thinking through this, and I think like Jacobs's text provides, I think, ways to kind of think about this, because it presents such complex scenes of like what I just might sometimes want to land on. Is like, yeah, that's intimacy. When this happens, they're having this intimate moment, and this is like what the text is saying about intimacy. But then it's like, okay, intimacy is disrupted. And so I think like I'm moving towards thinking about like intimacy as momentary, intimacy as Black survival, intimacy as these kinds of things.
Yeah. We are in very difficult times in our nation, and I'm very curious to know what lessons can be learned from Harriet Jacobs and Frederick Douglass's engagement in community care and healing, particularly in this present moment of racial reckoning.
There was in 2018, I believe it was over 3 days. It was a conference that was organized around Simone Lee's work at the Guggenheim, and it brought together just some of the most seminal, important figures in both the academy, also artists and like artists who work both like scholar activists, people who work within the academy and outside the academy. And the exhibition was called Loophole of Retreat. And so just artists came to kind of talk about the importance of the work, and like the importance of Simone Lee's work in terms of like practices of freedom, practices of refusal, and also kind of situating the work within a kind of Black feminist epistemology. And so this moving between like her art pieces that also kind of engaged with sound, and the sound recordings took up, there was like one sound recording that actually had new, like I want to say like it was the news report of the sort of birth of, so it was like, so it essentially like was a sonic recording of the events around Move. And so like she called it like a sonic protection in terms of like the art piece itself providing some form of escape for Black people and for, I want to say Black people, and not just like sort of the multiracial patrons that probably was in the exhibition. But I guess when I think about Jacob's work and I think about like what it has to offer, I think like these, like it teach, like I think like instead of lessons, when I read it, I think like it teaches me something about forms of refusal. Like it teaches me something about spaces of enclosure, or spaces of enclosure that I think I'm occupying, I think is totalizing, um, that don't actually define the terms of like me. So I think of like, she's like teaching me to be like self-reflexive about the terms of like enclosure, and also understanding that um that forms of enclosure always have moments to like steal, escape, refuse, to think otherwise, and to like not just survive but like to create within that. And so, you know, and always kind of striving for forms of freedom that are not here, but that are like, I don't know, that are ongoing practices. And so I read her work as like teaching me how to like teaching me how to like think about that as a practice of like being in the world, and thinking about that in terms of like being a Black woman in the world, um, is like actually really central to me.
Yeah, I mean, I think the self-reflexive move is totally on the table with Douglas. Before I continue, let me just say I remembered. McCune Smith references Douglas being part of a line of people like Alexander Dumas, Ira Aldridge, Miss Springfield. So, so for the sake of being scholastic. Um,
Douglas would like approve. He's like, you did really great there.
So, I mean, I think what Douglas, I was having this conversation actually this week. I was teaching Douglas in my class. And I think what Douglas really enlivens for me is the importance of like the text and the subtext, because so much is happening in, I mean, you know, outside of a certain kind of belief in subjectivity, hence why he writes 3 autobiographies. I mean, there's so much that's happening beyond the text that, you know, that you read on the page that really enlivens a kind of conversation about that in some ways, a conversation that in some ways implicates all of us, even though it is not our story. And so I think, you know, reading Douglas, and you know, as I said in my lecture, I think one of the reasons why he maintains a certain kind of canonical and cultural lore is because there is something about the text that is that it almost is a kind of charismatic text where you're reading it and you really, I mean, you really are kind of rooting rooting for this man to kind of overcome, right? But even past that, there are these moments that enliven a whole bunch of different ways of thinking about what were these people experiencing in these moments, and what are the ways that, you know, in some based on what you just said, that they kind of refuse these kinds of interesting modes of dominance. And I think the other thing too that Douglas provides in this moment, I mean, in light of him making the case that, you know, my love of letters is because my mother was a genius, part of me wants to say that, I mean, I think there's something to be said just for the act of writing. Like, what does it mean to just tell a story? You know, I mean, and even though that's become a kind of trite, you know, like, you know, this, the danger. Yes, yes. But I mean, I think that there's something to be said about the fact that, you know, either textually or subtextually, that Douglas tells a story that presumably would engender in the readers, and again, this is what I said to my students, you know, like, that we can read these stories, they can read the narrative, all or any of the narratives really, and see that in some ways the implication is precisely that how could we read this written in 1845, 1855, 1892, and still see many of the same things happening today? Like, how do we get here, right? And then what does it mean that we're still here? And then where do we go from here? So I think that that's also some of what I think Douglas provides, is not necessarily a way out, because I would say for even the sake of my own work, like, I'm much more interested in sitting in it for a little while at the very least. But what does it mean to narrate it? What does it mean to tell it? And for what it's worth, like in the case of the three autobiographies, what does it mean to tell it sometimes in completely different ways? So, I even think about how in the autobiographies, we know of Aunt Hester, and then at one point he calls her Esther. You know, so that there's something even about invention and imagination that I think in combination with narration really gives us an opportunity to think about how we narrate and how we tell stories, just in general.
Yes, absolutely. Eve, can you offer insight on the kinds of fugitive practices within Harriet Jacobs' incidents in the life of a slave girl as tied to resistance and freedom?
So one thing that I talked about, and one thing that is central in the chapter that I have on Jacobs, is the ways that, or the argument that I'm making, that what she's doing by engaging in the sexual relation with Dr. Flint is kind of pushing against parta sequitur ventrum, which is the law that dictates that children born to slave mothers inherit the status of the slave mother. And so, that becomes a way for her to imagine alternative possibilities, to kind of refuse the law, to refuse the terms of kind of enclosure, of social enclosure. And it provides like this fugitive moment of escape. And it's like a really kind of a limited mode of like escape. But it's one that I think, one that I'm really interested in thinking about at the level of the body. And so there's a way that, like, for me, thinking about that form of refusal, that form of escape, at the level of like, it's not even like at the level of like, she's pushing against concepts of mothering and motherhood, but she's doing it in a way that takes us back to like the body. And so there's, for me, that just provides a space to kind of think about like how alternative forms, like how like, I think I'm really interested in like affect and like the like how kind of desire functions in this. And there's something about the way that she's like refusing this at the level of like mothering, but that is actually kind of bodily. And then about like, it sort of links up to like ideas of the flesh that provide a way to think about like affect, to think about and to not lose sight of the body, and the ways that like, even though the body is a domain that is seemingly under like legal constraints, that it is actually something that she has some capacity and some space to maneuver within that. And so it becomes important. It becomes an important site for me to think about how it also can be a site that is like denied her, but also a site that she can reimagine and push and refuse against sort of legal constraints that seem, again, like totalizing and all encompassing. And this becomes like a mode that I'm trying to think of, that I'm trying to work through in terms of like how she's able to create like a sense of like escape and freedom that is not located in like a physical space, like literally the space that she's like contained in for, I believe, 6 years, but like a space that's kind of located within her own self or her own body.
Yeah, yeah. Augustus, you position Frederick Douglass as part of the longer trajectory of blues writers. I was very intrigued by this, an artist in the 20th century. Could you expand on your reading of Frederick Douglass as a bluesman?
Yeah, that's a kind of a burgeoning idea that emerged while reading the narrative. In particular, he talks about the slaves singing in the dense woods and reverberations in the dense woods. Um, but some of what interests me about uh, Douglas as a kind of bluesman is that in that in that excerpt of the narrative, he suggests singing, like uh, being some kind of singer, and then actually this week during class, returning to the second narrative, there's a moment where he says that he would sing. If I recall, I think he says something like to the effect of he would sing for Covey. So it is interesting to think about the fact that Douglas, in all the things that I think about him, that Douglas also might have been a singer, and somehow that to me has an interesting play along the idea of him being most well known as an orator. That maybe there's something going on around the singing and the oratory that I think is interesting, which maybe I think again enlivens the idea of the blues tradition as a performative mode. But again, I think even though I kind of charted with Douglas, I mean, certainly I think that there is a way that you can maybe even say Equiano is kind of trafficking in a kind of blues criticism, because he makes these cases for, like, sound and the sonic. Um, but I think with Douglas, and again thinking with Clyde Woods, that in many ways it's like totally the blues epistemology that Clyde Woods develops, thinking about the blues as a tradition of, and maybe we're coming full circle here, as a tradition of self-reflexivity, so that when Douglas is sitting at his desk and he's thinking about these, essentially songs of sorrow, again, a precursor to the voice, like it is a moment of self-reflection where he's saying, like, even now while I'm sitting here, I'm shedding a tear because, I didn't understand those reverberations in the dense woods, but yet somehow being within the circle and being without the circle, I somehow sitting at the desk, like, fully understand what's going on. And so for me, I think that kind of notion of a kind of critique of these sounds, and especially recognizing that if these slaves in these woods are singing what likely is spirituals, or some kind of maybe even work songs of some sort, that, like that certainly is a precursor to the blues in the 20th century. That in some ways, Douglas is actually already giving us an interesting way of understanding, I mean, music criticism in a particular way. And again, I think the fact that he also, at least in the first and second autobiography in particular, those are the ones I know the best, but in the first and second autobiography, he's actually also suggesting that he's a practitioner. I think only enlivens the belief that I have that, like in some ways he totally is a bluesman.
Yeah. So we're gonna have I'm gonna ask a couple more questions and then we're gonna open it up for Q&A. But this next question is for Eve. Can you shed light on how Harriet Jacobs was able to forge impossible relations and intimacies? If you can go a little bit more in depth on that, and how did this shape her sense, in particular, of belonging?
I almost feel like I'm like keep saying kinship and intimacy, that like those are the things that like I'm pivoting on is like foundational. Um, when you asked the question, I paused on the last, like this idea of belonging. And I think I paused on it because then the question that I had for myself is like, what does belonging mean in this period, and for like whom does she belong? And so I think something that's like important for me in this chapter, in the presentation that I gave, is the idea that like um, intimacy, kinship, and belonging are things that are already in place. And so from the perspective and stance of her family, And so she already belongs. She already has a sense of like deep intimacy. There are already like testimonials that are being told to her, and so that she actually recalls, and insights of her family that she draws on. And so um, she belongs, but and so partly what she belongs to the Black enslaved community, the Black free community, the sympathetic white abolitionists, somewhat brown. But you know, the intimacy is there. It's kind of like, and I think one of the biggest things in the project is like a lot of what I look at, and in particular in this text, is like these intimacies, these like descriptions of intimacy are like embedded. And so so when I say they're already there, someone might say like, where are they? And like literally, where do they exist in like a text like Jacob's, where intimacy is something that belongs to the master? The belonging is like a question because she belongs. She doesn't even like, and so partly what I'm trying to think about and what I'm trying to develop is like a practice of reading that is trying to get at what's embedded in texts that seem already written or over determined by like the frame. And so there's a lot of 18th century slave narratives, and especially Caribbean slave narratives, that are inside other slave narratives. And so partly what I'm thinking about using, like the way that 18th century slave narratives are constructed, is like using, like thinking about like, okay, what does that mean for the ways that I can read intimacy and like belonging at the familial level that like Jacobs is constructing in her narrative. And so partly what I'm trying to do is to try to develop a practice of reading these embedded texts in 19th century texts. And so that means like going into Jacobs and looking at the moments when she begins to narrate, in quotation marks, stories of other enslaved people. And so that intimacy might not be the kind that like that passes itself or presents itself as like love. It might not be the intimacy that we might expect, or we might read as something that's like care. Because there's a lot of scenes in Jacobs where she's like appalled in some ways, to use like at like scenes of slave mothers like willfully giving children away, or like not displaying or not presenting like a kind of proper or sufficient empathy or love. But so those are scenes of intimacy. And so but they're being narrated, like, so what I'm trying to do is like to like kind of mine that text, and for the embedded like stories that are in there. And there's a, oh, I'm forgetting her name. We'll just like chalk it up to like I'll remember it later. She's a scholar at Northeastern in the English department, and she's doing work around this, but she's doing it thinking about like the Caribbean, and thinking about slave texts that are written earlier, and really understanding like 19th century slave texts that like have the "I was a slave" is actually in the 18th century in the Caribbean were written like in forms that like we don't read them as slave narratives because they don't have this like 19th century sort of construction as like a quintessential slave narrative. And so I'm trying to use or think about that practice as and bring that to the 19th century and bring it to a text like Jacob's, where like thinking of where like testimonial is oral, testimonial comes in these fragments. It doesn't present itself as like, um, uh, it doesn't present itself in terms of like having a closure, or even a beginning. And so like my work of kind of thinking about the way intimacy functions in that text and belonging functions is like really kind of thinking about it as a mode and practice of reading embedded narratives and fragments.
Mhm, mhm. Well, I want to take this time to, we're at 6:46, and so I want to open the Q&A. And we actually have a question, um, and this was part of the discussion that was happening earlier, but this is from Dr. Ann Rice and talking about the private and the public. And she asked, isn't she speaking, particularly Harriet Jacobs, on different registers? Can you speak to that, Eve?
Well, I guess yes, like in one way, like she's speaking on different registers in terms of like the public and private. Um, I guess I don't like if the question is coming from like the 19th century under slavery, that register would be the public and private. There's no distinction. Yes, but I also would say that many scholars would argue now that like the distinction between the public and private in relation to Black social life is 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 similar, not the same. So an example of this in the contemporary moment is you can have a police officer enter Black homes um, without like, one would say cause, um, passing, like crossing over the threshold of the home, coming in, like touching everything, haptically altering the home, and exiting. And so there's a way that like in that scenario, the public and private um, like is like intertwined, infused. And so the distinction between those in the contemporary moment in this register um, is similar, not of course not the same. And so the thinking about this in terms of Jacobs is, I'm finding, I think the public and private distinction might be less useful in that moment, and thinking more about like kinship and intimacy gets me closer to kind of thinking about the ways that kind of Jacobs refused, navigated, contested, created spaces to like dream, to imagine freedom. And so those terms allow me to think that, rather than the public and private, which I think, I mean, don't hold for me.
Mhm. Does anyone else have any questions? You can unmute yourself and ask at this time.
And ask Augustus because I keep talking. And it takes me like 10 minutes to answer the question. So please just ask me.
Yes, go ahead. Yeah.
I have a question. I'm curious to know, in light of all the protests and all the many struggles that African American people are still facing these days, I was wondering, what does freedom of the African American man look like in the year 2021?
That's to me.
Yes.
What does freedom look like? I mean, try to be short. Such a loaded question. I mean, I think if I'm reading Douglas in a particular way, and I think we see this even after he is quote unquote free and is an abolitionist, that what he seems to suggest is that freedom is always progressive in a particular way. That it's not, that freedom is always, the boys would say, a spiritual striving, this kind of thing. But part of me wants to say, at least with the way that I'm reading Douglas, is that I think that freedom for Douglas, and perhaps this then also translates to the contemporary moment, that freedom for Douglas is just about the ability to make choices. I think. So again, for me, when I think about him having 9 lives, now some of that's also my reading into it, yeah. But I mean, just at the level of the way he narrates himself in the biographies, he's likened to oxen. He's likened to a horse. He's likened to a cat. I mean, and thinking about, again, about Pan-Africanism, like that he reads his mother as Egyptian pharaoh and then calls himself a cat is a totally Pan-African idea because of the way that cats are revered in Egypt. The fact that he names the second autobiography My Bondage and My Freedom, totally a reference to Moses. When he fights Mr. Covey and he defeats Mr. Covey, he says, like, we were equals. It was as if neither of us had color. And he likens himself to being resurrected. So it seems like, at least for Douglas, and again, I think that that freedom is the ability to make choices for oneself, I think. I mean, that's really, in some ways, a very simple answer, but I think it is at the very least profound, because I mean, and again, if I think about Douglas, Douglas makes a choice. The choices that Douglas makes amounts to him telling his story 3 different times, right? That there's something to the repetition of being able to make a choice about the fact that in the first autobiography, I don't really tell you much about my mother. And then the second and third, I'm already saying, she was a genius. She bakes me this cake, the cake that she bakes me, becomes the impetus for me, like, choosing my birthday. I mean, it obviously, in some ways, nearest to me, the fact of changing one's name. I mean, he's born Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey and becomes Frederick Douglass. I mean, there's something to, I think, choices that I think Douglas hints at. And so again, I think for me, then the text and the subtext is totally valid, because I think that for him, like, it's about choosing. And I don't necessarily think that necessarily has to amount to like a mode of like self-determination per se. It can, but I do think that there's something to say about the fact that, like, he especially in his adult life as an abolitionist, I mean, he's just making choices.
Mm-hmm. We have another question in the chat, and then I'm gonna go to the hand that's raised. So it asks if either of you could talk about self-reflexivity in relation to affect.
So in my project, I really take up psychoanalysis. And so the way that I read Douglas is I want to make the case that Douglas is actually, in all of his work, is actually thinking totally in a psychoanalytic frame, such that Douglas predates European psychoanalysis. And so what that means is that the moments where Douglas is narrating, like, his mother, his grandmother, these moments, again, like, while sitting at this desk, I weep, remembering those dense woods, that in many ways it's like it's totally a moment of reflection on the self, which is another reason why I'm very much interested in melancholy, because melancholy itself is a kind of, melancholy by way of a kind of interesting interpretation for me of like the blues, or like what Albert Murray calls the blues idiom, is that it's totally an opportunity to really like reflect on what is lost. And then for me, the performance of genius is actually to express that loss. So that in those ways, I mean, Douglas is totally self-reflexive at the level of affect. But I think too, what it does is it brings online the fact that, and Spillers makes this argument near the end of Mama's Baby, Papa's Maybe, an American grammar book, that, like slavery in the United States is like the prime site to understand psychoanalysis. Because if the notion of psychoanalysis is the notion of loss that stems from the parent, or like loss that stems from home, the loss of one's liberty, country, I mean, the slave is the prime site for understanding that. So that when we read Douglass, and Douglass is saying things like, I mean, a perfect moment of self-reflexivity. When Douglass is saying things like, I don't have memories of my mother except for the fact that she would walk 12 miles at night and put me to sleep. And yet, despite not knowing the woman, and I think at one point he says basically like she was estranged to me, like when the news of her death was as if the death of a stranger. I mean, it's totally psychoanalytic. That's my mother was the death of a stranger, and yet, if I can track the fact that my mother knew how to read in Tuckahoe, Maryland, and that then enlivens my love of letters, then there's no way that the texts that I write are not totally referential of the thing that I lost.
Mm-hmm.
So there's all this kind of self-reflective and affective work that Douglass is doing that suggests to me that, even though I take up psychoanalysis, that in some ways, Black people have always been engaged in psychoanalysis, it's just that we didn't call it that, right? So in those ways, I would say that, the self-reflexive and the affective are totally on hand in Douglass. And again, and I would say in other people too. So I mean, for what it's worth, Harriet Jacobs is totally affective, like totally.
Mm-hmm. You want to speak to that, Eve, at all, or?
No, I guess I don't exactly treat like intimacy, so self-reflection and intimacy. I'm thinking more like self-reflexive production as a space of creating freedom, as a space of kind of thinking and imagining and dreaming and planning freedom.
Mm-hmm.
And that's all I want to say about that.
Mm-hmm. And our last question, we have time for one more question. If you could talk, and this is in the chat, particularly to Augustus, if you could talk about the fact that Douglass was the most photographed person, which you do talk about in your presentation in the 19th century by choice, what does this mean in terms of his narrative of self?
Well, Douglass being so invested in self-portraiture is certainly in line with his preoccupation with being a subject, totally, right? That, subjectivity is always on hand for him. But at the same time, and so this is another reason why, when I think about kind of like the notion of like Pan-African or diasporic thinker, something that actually really interests me about Douglass being the most photographed American in the 19th century is that Alexander Dumas, so another mixed race writer in France in the 19th century, also has like a really interesting history around portraiture and photography. So it seems like in this moment, with the rise of this technology, that these men are really taking up the photography as a way to kind of mark selfhood, like totally, right? But at the same time, I want to say, and this is something that I mentioned in my talk, is that, oftentimes when people narrate Douglass speaking or Douglass talking, that they also reference him being handsome. Like, like this kind of tall man with this booming voice. So that in those ways, I think, if we're trafficking in psychoanalysis, like that Douglass may also be quite a narcissist, right? In a kind of interesting way, right? And no, that's like kind of tongue in cheek. I don't want to negate the fact that like, the fact of taking photos and being photographed so often, I think is totally a way in which to not only kind of like humanize himself amid the moment that he's living and amid these ideas around Black people as being inhuman and animal and these sort of things, like totally, yes. But I do think that, if some of the work around Douglass is correct, that, like it is unclear whether or not he was reading, like Enlightenment thought, or if he had access to Enlightenment thought. I mean, I would make the case that a lot of the rhetorical moves he makes are very much in line with certain kinds of Enlightenment thought. You know, like then there's a way in which, like, you know, also the photograph is an opportunity, you know, to think about perfection, like that he's constantly perfecting himself and really kind of channeling, because he starts, you know, very young, you know, so My Bondage and My Freedom, you know, the cover is a picture of him, right? You know, so it's not that so he's moves from like the drawing to the photo. And also, you know, for what it's worth, and this is why I would also make the case that Douglas is, I think, has his hand in a couple of different literary genres, is that because Douglas is also living during the Victorian period, I mean, we also know that like Victorianism is totally invested in like portraiture, and, you know, like how that portraiture manifests in books and, you know, like in parlors, you know. So I think Douglas is definitely legible in multiple registers, and that perhaps that is the case, then it is the case that the photograph is doing multiple forms of work. And the last thing I'll say is that there's an interesting reading of Douglas as a kind of, again, like precursor to like Roland Barthes' notion of photography. And there's a moment where Douglas has read, I believe it's Laura Wexler.
Yeah.
Reads Douglas as the Revenant. So like on the one hand, it's both like the dream and the resurrected thing, right? So that like, you know, like that the photograph is a constant aspirational tool for Douglas to think about what it means to like be perfected and to be gazed at. And to, again, like this, the idea that like he kind of manifests as a kind of dream, as like, and then this kind of as a resurrection.
Yeah. Well, I want to thank you all for joining us for this very rich conversation, rich dialogue this evening. I want to thank the Lehman Art Gallery for sponsoring this program. And I wish everyone a safe evening. Thank you to the presenters as well. And have a great night, everyone.